The midday sun mercilessly scorched the asphalt of Fort Henderson military base, creating heat waves that distorted the view like desert mirages. Amid the flow of spotless uniforms and boots marching in perfect cadence, a solitary figure walked with measured steps toward the main gate. John Thompson, 78 years old, carried on his back the weight of decades few could ever comprehend. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from time itself, which collects its due from every warrior. The veteran clutched a yellowed envelope against his chest, as if protecting the last fragment of a life few truly knew. The base reception buzzed with the typical energy of a Monday morning, when orders were distributed and missions took shape. John approached the front desk with the patience of someone who had learned that haste is the enemy of precision, especially on military grounds. The young soldier on duty, his freshly polished insignia gleaming under the fluorescent light, barely lifted his eyes from the paperwork. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked in a protocol tone, showing not the slightest genuine interest. The veteran gently placed the envelope on the counter, revealing documents dating back to an era when heroism was measured in blood and sacrifice, not likes and views. "I came to deliver some documents to the Veterans Department," John said in a calm voice, each word carrying a dignity that transcended his modest appearance. His worn military jacket clashed starkly with the spotless uniforms bustling around, as if he were a ghost from forgotten battles, visiting a world that had moved on without him. The soldier finally looked up, and his eyes were inevitably drawn to the veteran's right arm, where a faded tattoo emerged beneath the rolled-up sleeve. The ink, once vibrant, was now only a bluish shadow on skin marked by time. It was impossible to fully make out the design, but there was something about that mark that stirred a malicious curiosity in the young soldier. The atmosphere began to shift subtly, like dark clouds gathering on the horizon before a storm. Other soldiers, intrigued by their comrades' curiosity, discreetly moved closer to the front desk. John remained still, with the patience of a man who had faced situations far more daunting than curious stares and barely disguised whispers. He could not imagine that this seemingly insignificant moment was about to trigger a chain of events that would reveal truths long buried in military archives. The veteran adjusted the envelope once more, unaware that he was holding far more than mere documents. He was carrying an emotional time bomb ready to explode. The first low chuckle echoed through the reception, like the first thunder of an approaching storm, breaking the protocol silence that usually dominated military environments. Private Jake Morrison, only 22 years old, and with less than 6 months of service, leaned over the counter to get a better look at the faded tattoo on John's arm. "Man, what kind of drawing is that on your arm?" he asked with a malicious grin dancing on his lips, his voice dripping with the boundless arrogance of youth. The other soldiers around began to close in like hyenas, circling wounded prey, their faces lit up with the prospect of entertainment at the expense of the elderly veteran. John kept his eyes fixed on the documents on the counter, but something in his posture stiffened ever so slightly. The situation escalated quickly when Private Tommy Chen joined the mockery, blatantly pointing at the faded tattoo. "Looks like somebody tried drawing something blindfolded," he said loudly enough for the entire reception to hear, sparking a wave of muffled laughter among the younger soldiers. The bluish-grey ink on John's skin had indeed lost all definition over the decades, making it impossible to distinguish the original details. To those young servicemen, accustomed to sharp, colorful tattoos of the modern era, the old mark seemed primitive and amateurish. John finally raised his eyes, and for a brief moment, something dangerous flickered in them. Not anger, but something far deeper and more controlled. "I bet it was done in some back alley parlor in the 60s, Morrison continued, now fully emboldened by his comrades' laughter and the veteran's apparent passivity. The group had grown to 7 or 8 soldiers, all entertained by what they considered harmless fun at the expense of an old civilian. They didn't realize that every word was like salt in wounds that had never fully healed. that every laugh echoed like machine gun fire on battlefields they would never know. John drew in a deep breath, his hands slowly closing into trembling fists, not from weakness, but from an inner strength being tested to its limits. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity, heavy with electric tension. The climax of humiliation came when Chen decided to mimic what he imagined the original tattoo had been, sketching exaggerated gestures in the air as if drawing. Must have been something super original, like an anchor or a heart with "Mom" written inside, he said provocatively, causing an outburst of laughter among the soldiers. John closed his eyes for a moment, and in that brief instant, his mind traveled to places those young men could never imagine, not even in their worst nightmares. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed in them, a resignation mixed with a profound sadness that transcended the present moment. He gathered his documents with hands that no longer trembled and prepared to leave, but fate had other plans for that seemingly ordinary Monday morning. What had begun as private mockery quickly turned into a public spectacle when other servicemen at the base stopped to watch the scene unfolding in the reception hall. Morrison, intoxicated by the attention and laughter, decided to raise the level of his cruel performance. "Folks, come check out this masterpiece right here," he shouted across the reception, gesturing dramatically toward John's arm as if presenting a circus act. The veteran stood still, his back straight, maintaining flawless military posture even as a storm of humiliation rained down on him. His eyes, however, began to reveal a pain that went far beyond the momentary embarrassment. It was the pain of a man watching his dignity torn apart by those he had once helped protect. The crowd grew quickly, turning the reception into an improvised arena where John was the reluctant gladiator facing lions starving for entertainment. Chen climbed onto a nearby chair and began narrating like a sports commentator. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the most mysterious tattoo in the history of the US military." The audience roared with laughter, some even pulling out their phones to snap pictures, capturing for the digital eternity a moment that would become an indelible scar on the conscience of everyone present. John lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but like a wounded bull still holding onto its inner strength. The noise of laughter and cruel remarks echoed against the walls of the reception hall like a diabolical symphony that seemed to have no end. One particularly brazen soldier named David Price stepped closer to John and pretended to examine the tattoo with an imaginary magnifying glass. "Professor, looks like this ink was applied with a jackhammer," he said, sparking another wave of hysterical laughter that reverberated down the main corridor of the base. Other soldiers began inventing absurd stories about the tattoo's origin, each one more ridiculous than the last, turning the moment into a competition of cruel creativity. John held the documents firmly against his chest, as if they were a shield protecting him from the verbal arrows flying his way. His lips moved silently, and any attentive observer would have noticed that he was reciting something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps the names of long-fallen comrades. The height of cruelty came when Morrison decided to perform an exaggerated imitation of what John must have been like in his youth, marching awkwardly down the hallway while pretending to sport a tattoo on his arm. "Look at me. I'm a tough veteran with a super scary tattoo," he shouted, provoking an eruption of laughter that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. John finally lifted his head and looked straight at Morrison, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. His eyes showed no anger or humiliation, but rather a deep, sorrowful compassion, as if he were looking at lost children who did not know what they were doing. The veteran opened his mouth to speak for the first time since the mockery had begun, but his words were cut short by the unmistakable sound of military boots marching down the hallway toward the reception, a sound that made every soldier present stiffen instantly. General William Harrison emerged from the main corridor like a force of nature embodied, his 4 stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights like beacons of unquestionable authority. The 58-year-old man, his grey hair impeccably combed and his posture radiating decades of command and respect earned on battlefields around the world, stopped abruptly at the entrance to the reception. His steel eyes swept across the scene with the surgical precision of a sniper identifying targets, absorbing in an instant every detail of the situation before him. The silence that followed was so absolute that the beating of a fly's wings could have been heard, every soldier frozen in awkward positions like salt statues caught in the middle of a storm. Harrison did not speak a word at first, but his presence alone was enough to drain all the festive energy from the room, replacing it with a palpable tension that made the air feel as dense as concrete. The general advanced slowly toward the center of the reception, each step echoing like hammer strikes against the deadly silence that had fallen. Morrison and Chen, who moments earlier had been kings of cruel comedy, now looked like cornered rats scrambling to hide behind their comrades, their pale faces a stark contrast to the arrogant confidence they had displayed just seconds before. John remained exactly where he was, but something in his posture shifted subtly. His back straightened even further, and he instinctively adjusted his shoulders into a position that any seasoned soldier would immediately recognize as attention. The veteran looked directly at the general, and for a brief, infinitesimal moment, something passed between the two men, a silent recognition that transcended words and rank. Harrison stopped exactly 3 meters from John, his eyes still scanning the crowd of soldiers, who now looked like mischievous children caught red-handed by a stern father. General Harrison began pacing in slow circles around the reception area, like a predator studying its prey, his piercing eyes shifting between the nervous soldiers and the veteran who stood serenely at the center of the storm. Every calculated step of the general felt like an eternity, the sound of his boots echoing like the ticking of a deadly metronome, marking the shrinking time these young soldiers had to explain themselves. He noticed the cell phones still in some soldiers' hands, the guilty expressions etched onto their faces, and most of all, he fixed his attention on the faded tattoo on John's arm. Something in his eyes changed when he saw that ancient mark, a flicker of recognition accompanied by the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The silence dragged on like refined psychological torture, each passing second exponentially raising the atmospheric pressure in the room. Harrison finally stopped his predatory walk directly in front of Morrison, the main instigator of the humiliation, and stared at him with an intensity that could melt steel. "Private Morrison," the general said in a low voice heavy with such authority that the very walls of the reception seemed to tremble, "I'd like you to explain to me exactly what was happening here when I arrived." The young soldier swallowed hard, the sound of his throat audible as it echoed through the silent reception like a pistol shot in a library. Morrison opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water, his words stubbornly refusing to form coherent sentences under the crushing weight of the general's gaze. John watched the scene with an unreadable expression, his hands still clutching tightly to the documents that had brought him to the base, unaware he was about to witness something that would forever change the perspective of everyone present. We were just..." Morrison stammered pathetically, his words disintegrating in the air like ashes in the wind, unable to form a coherent explanation for the inexplicable. General Harrison took one more step forward, his imposing 6'1" frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the trembling soldier before him whole. "Just what, Private?" Harrison asked, his voice slicing through the air like a sharpened blade, every word delivered with the lethal precision of a sniper's shot. Chen tried to slip discreetly to the back of the group, but the general's eyes found him instantly, freezing him in place like a rabbit caught in the headlights of a speeding truck. The tension was so unbearable that it seemed any sudden movement might trigger an explosion, and John continued watching with that disturbing serenity only true war veterans could maintain under extreme pressure. "Sir, we were commenting on this gentleman's tattoo," Chen finally managed to mutter, his voice barely more than a desperate whisper that sounded pitiful even to his own ears. The general turned slowly to face Chen, his movements deliberate, like a great predator preparing for its final strike, and his expression grew even harsher, if such a thing was humanly possible. "Commenting," Harrison repeated, the word leaving his mouth like distilled venom, dripping with contempt that made the air itself feel colder. "And what kind of comments were you making about the tattoo of an American veteran on a United States military base?" The question hung in the air like a suspended guillotine, ready to sever any inadequate answer that dared to fall from their lips. John took a small step forward, as if he wished to intervene and spare the young men from what was coming, but something in the general's gaze made him remain silent. General Harrison walked silently toward John, stopping just inches away, and with a slow, deliberate motion that made everyone hold their breath, he began to roll up the sleeve of his military shirt. The entire room watched in sepulchral silence as Harrison revealed his own right arm, and when the sleeve was finally raised, a collective gasp of shock and disbelief echoed through the reception hall. There it was, the same tattoo, identical in every detail, only slightly better preserved due to the difference in age between the two men. "Soldiers," the general said, his voice trembling with restrained emotion, "you have just mocked the tattoo of Sergeant Major John Thompson, the highest unofficial decoration an American soldier can carry." John's eyes filled with unspilled tears as he finally met the general's gaze, and in that crystalline moment, decades of silent pain and unrecognized sacrifice materialized in the air like long dormant spirits returning to life. Harrison turned to face the petrified soldiers, his voice now carrying an authority that transcended military rank, emanating from the deepest place where honor and sacrifice meet. "This tattoo," he said, pointing first to his own arm and then to John's, "can only be earned in one way, by saving the lives of at least 10 American soldiers in direct combat with the enemy." "Day." The silence that followed was so absolute that time itself seemed to pause to process the magnitude of the revelation, each soldier present crushed by the weight of their ignorance and cruelty. Morrison felt his legs give way, forcing him to lean against the wall to avoid collapsing, while Chen covered his face with his hands, unable to process the devastating truth that had just been revealed. John stood still, but at last silent tears began to stream down his time-worn cheeks, not of shame, but of a profound relief he had waited decades to feel. General Harrison walked over to a nearby table and, with reverent movements, opened a folder he carried with him, revealing classified documents that looked as though they had been preserved for decades like sacred relics. "Sergeant Major Thompson," he began, his voice now filled with a profound respect that echoed through the reception hall like a military hymn, "saved the lives of 17 American soldiers during the Battle of Khe Sanh in Vietnam in 1968. The young soldiers watched in absolute shock as Harrison read the details of a mission that had been kept secret for decades, how John had remained alone in an exposed position for 48 consecutive hours, facing endless waves of enemy attacks to evacuate his wounded comrades. Morrison felt the world collapse around him as he realized he had mocked one of the greatest living American military heroes, a man whose acts of courage surpassed anything he could imagine in his wildest fantasies. The weight of reality struck every soldier present like a warhammer, crushing their youthful souls under the unbearable burden of shame and regret. Harrison continued reading from the classified file, each word slicing through the air like shrapnel from an emotional grenade exploding inside the consciences of the soldiers. He refused medical evacuation 3 consecutive times, remaining in combat until the last of his men was safe, resulting in permanent injuries he carries to this day. John finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence like the song of a wounded bird that still manages to produce a beautiful melody. "They were just boys, General. Boys like these here. I couldn't abandon them. The entire room seemed to lean toward the veteran, as if every person present were magnetically drawn by the moral gravity of his simple yet profound words. Chen collapsed into a nearby chair, openly sobbing as the reality of his cruel actions crystallized in his young mind, forever transforming his understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the true meaning of serving one's country. Morrison was the first to break under the crushing pressure of reality, falling to his knees on the cold reception floor as uncontrollable sobs shook his young body like emotional earthquakes. "Sir, I didn't know. Forgive me, please," he pleaded through tears, his words shattering in the air like broken glass, each syllable carrying a regret so deep it seemed to tear at his very soul. One by one, the other soldiers began approaching John, some kneeling, others standing with their heads bowed in a gesture of respect and shame that transcended any formal military protocol. John looked at each of those young faces marked by remorse and, surprisingly, extended his trembling hand to help Morrison to his feet, demonstrating a compassion that left everyone present even more emotionally devastated. General Harrison watched the scene with eyes that shone with pride for the veteran and deep sorrow for the soldiers who had just learned a lesson that would mark their lives forever. Chen approached John with hesitant steps, like a child walking up to a father after a terrible misdeed, and when he finally found the courage to speak, his words came out as a whisper laden with absolute reverence. "Mr. Thompson, how can you forgive us after what we've done?" The question lingered in the air, like incense in a cathedral, and John placed his calloused hand on the young soldier's shoulder, his eyes reflecting decades of wisdom gained through unimaginable suffering. "Son," he said with a voice carrying the serenity of one who had faced death and emerged with a deeper understanding of life, "you are exactly the age of the boys I saved in Vietnam. How could I hold a grudge against you?" The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was no longer a silence of tension or shame, but a sacred silence of transformation, where young souls were forged in the fire of humility and true recognition. Every soldier present knew that moment would be etched in their memory for eternity, a lesson about honor, sacrifice, and the true measure of a hero. 3 months after that day, which forever changed the course of several young lives, Fort Henderson Military Base inaugurated the Sergeant Major John Thompson Memorial, a hall dedicated to educating others about the true meaning of military service and silent sacrifice. Morrison and Chen, now transformed into passionate defenders of honoring veterans, personally led guided tours, telling every new group of recruits the story of the man they had humiliated and who, in return, had taught them about forgiveness and true dignity. John attended the inauguration ceremony, now wearing a ceremonial military jacket personally commissioned by General Harrison, his decorations finally gleaming on his chest with the recognition they had deserved for decades. The tears streaming down the faces of all present were not of sorrow, but of a profound, transformative joy, the kind that comes when justice and compassion meet in perfect harmony. The veteran looked around the room, filled with young soldiers and seasoned veterans, all united by a renewed understanding that true heroism does not reside in medals or honors, but in the ability to carry invisible scars with silent dignity. On the main wall of the memorial, a golden plaque forever captured the words John had spoken on that transformative day. "They were just boys. I couldn't abandon them." Below the inscription, a black and white photograph showed young John Thompson in the fields of Vietnam, surrounded by the 17 soldiers whose lives he had saved, their radiant faces contrasting with the devastation of war in the background. General Harrison, now retired but still regularly visiting the base, often stopped before the plaque and reflected on how a moment of youthful cruelty had transformed into the most powerful lesson on honor the base had ever witnessed. Morrison, now a respected sergeant, carried a small photograph of John in his wallet, a constant reminder that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they consider vulnerable. And somewhere in the universe, the spirits of the 17 soldiers who had died decades after being saved by John smiled, knowing that the legacy of their savior would continue to inspire future generations to choose compassion over cruelty, honor over arrogance, and love over indifference.